Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here are your hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Thank you, Dal. And Joe, welcome back from vacation.
I'm sorry to be here. I mean, yes, thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you for doing such a wonderful job while I was gone.
Oh, thank you for entrusting me with Press the Button. It was really just a lot of fun.
Well, I could tell, and it went so well that we are now changing the format of this show. And I'm pleased to announce that Michelle and I will now co-host this. Michelle will take over the anchor chair for early warning, so guide us through the top stories of the day. I'll still be doing the interviews, at least I think I'll still be doing the interviews, but now I got my eye on you.
I mean...
And so, but we're still going to keep the same format for the show. This podcast goes for 30 to 40 minutes. That is the flight time of an intercontinental ballistic missile, how long it would take to go from one country to the other if it was launched. And our news segment, Early Warning, that begins every episode, still remains at 7 minutes. Why? Because if the president was woken up in the middle of the night and told we were under a nuclear attack, that is at most how long he would have to decide whether he would press the button. If we can make that decision in 7 minutes, we could certainly do the news in 7 minutes. And we have a special episode for you today. This episode will air on August 6th of 2019, which is the 74th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and 3 days before the August 9th bombing of Nagasaki. In this special episode, we're bringing in excerpts from previous podcasts that had nuclear historian Alex Wellerstein, former Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes, former Pentagon analyst Dan Ellsberg, gender expert and analyst Carol Cohen, and Nobel Peace Laureate Beatrice Finn. All of them will talk about the meaning of the first time we dropped a nuclear bomb and the issue of whether we should ever again be the first to use a nuclear weapon. Should the United States reserve the right to start a nuclear war? All that is ahead, but the clock is ticking. Let's get going.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Joining Joe and I today to discuss the news is Kingston Reif, Director of Disarmament and Threat Reduction Policy at the Arms Control Association. Kingston, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Gentlemen, we had a heck of a week last week, so we're just going to dive into the news. First story, Kingston. On Friday, the INF Treaty collapsed as both the U.S. and Russia walked away from it. Among the many statements made that day, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, his statement stood out. He said he wants to deploy an intermediate range missile in the Pacific region within months, though that is likely to take some time. So while we clearly had issues with Russia violating the INF Treaty, how much was China a consideration on this? And how much of it was Russian violations?
So I think that Russia was still the primary reason why the administration decided to withdraw from the INF Treaty. But China no doubt played a role and was a factor in the decision. Numerous defense officials over the past several years have expressed concern that the U.S. military advantage in the Indo-Pacific is eroding, that China has been totally free to develop hundreds and hundreds of INF Treaty range missiles with which to threaten the United States and U.S. allies in the region, and that by developing its own ground-launched intermediate-range missiles, the United States could help to begin to stop that erosion, in their view, of the U.S. military position in the region. And Secretary Esper's comments on the same day that the United States withdrawal from the INF Treaty took effect reflected that. Now, in my view, the United States does not need ground-launched intermediate-range missiles in the Asia-Pacific. The risks would outweigh any limited potential benefits. And probably the biggest obstacle at this point is the fact that no ally in the region has yet to step forward to say that they would be willing to host those missiles. And to be of military value, the United States military would really need allies to be able to base those missiles.
Thanks, Kingston. Joe, last week, switching gears in the Democratic presidential candidate debate, Elizabeth Warren said she would adopt a policy of not using nuclear weapons first in a conflict were she to win the presidency, which Montana Governor Steve Bullock completely disagreed with. We're still talking about this exchange because Representative Liz Cheney attacked Warren for this on Twitter, which led Senator Bernie Sanders to jump in and defend Warren and her position on no first use. How much support is there for the U.S. adopting a no first use policy?
Well, given the experiences of the last 20 years, I don't know why anyone would take seriously strategic advice from a Cheney. Haven't they done enough damage to the United States so far? And Liz Cheney is picking up right where her father left with this kind of bombast and fear-mongering that, oh, if we change this policy, if we don't do exactly what I say, the U.S. is threatened. The hordes will attack us. Nonsense. What we are talking about here is the U.S. promising that it will never start a nuclear war, that we will never, under any circumstances, use a nuclear weapon. We haven't used a nuclear weapon in 74 years. And the U.S. has been in lots of wars. We've lost lots of wars. We've lost troops. Our allies have lost wars. Presidents have considered it, but in the end, never decided to press the button, never decided to use a nuclear weapon first. This should be the official policy of the United States. We don't want the President of the United States to have the ability to launch a nuclear weapon first for whatever reason, they think they should. It turns out that this is overwhelmingly popular among the American people. Polls show that 92% of Democrats and 88% of Republicans think that the U.S. nuclear arsenal should be used only for deterrence, only to prevent somebody from attacking us first. Let me say that again. 92% of Dems, and here's the killer, 88% of Republicans. So the people who are arguing for starting a nuclear war, for reserving the option to go first, are in a distinct minority in this country. Unfortunately, the media gives them this kind of strong megaphone. It's not supported by the opinions of the American public, or I would say the opinion of most of the peace activists, most of the national security analysts in this country.
So we only have a couple minutes left. Last week, the U.S. administration sanctioned Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif. This is yet another reminder that nothing about our current U.S. administration is normal. Sanctioning the foreign minister with whom you would assume to have negotiations. Kingston, why would the U.S. do this?
So like the INF Treaty, the Trump administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal without a viable plan to replace it. The administration has made a big deal about how it's seeking a better deal with Iran if only Iran were to meet 12 or so conditions that in their view means Iran behaving like a normal country, then Iran would be treated like a normal country. Of course, to be able to negotiate such a deal, you have to have someone to negotiate with.
You would
and
think.
So the administration's move here, I think, gives lie to the fact that its negotiating strategy with respect to Iran is a serious one.
So, but Joe, there have also been press reports that Trump is interested in having Senator Rand Paul be a diplomatic back channel, not so secret anymore. How would we know if the Trump administration decides to make a turn away from maximum pressure towards diplomacy?
The biggest problem we have with this administration is its strategic incoherence and its diplomatic incompetence. It's unclear what they want with Iran. There are clearly some, like John Bolton, who want to start a war with Iran, Mike Pompeo, who want to at least threaten to start a war with Iran. It doesn't appear that Trump wants that, but he doesn't seem to be capable of developing, as Kingston said, the alternative path. So, Sam Rayburn said that any jackass can kick down a barn. It takes a carpenter to build one. We got a lot of jackasses in this administration. They have kicked down a lot of barns, a lot of our national security pillars, and they have yet to erect one to replace it. And the way they're treating Zarif, who says this? Come to the Oval Office or else we'll sanction you. This is New Jersey mobster talk.
Definitely bullies.
This is a bullying tactic, trying to threaten somebody to come give the President of the United States a photo op. No, I think we're a long way from opening up some viable diplomacy, and that risks us entering into a very dangerous period where with Iran, where a miscalculation, an accident, an incident can start a war that no one truly wants. The International Crisis Group just issued a report on the perils of this approach. We're going to be interviewing its director, Rob Malley, for next week's episode. Stay tuned.
And with that, our 7 minutes are up. Thank you, Joe and Kingston.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
At 8:15 in the morning of August 6, Japanese time, the first atomic bomb hit an enemy target.
Welcome to a special edition of Press the Button. Today, I want to discuss with you two interrelated issues. One, should the United States ever use a nuclear weapon first? And two, what happened when we did use a nuclear weapon first, 74 years ago today, when the United States became the first nation in the world to use a nuclear weapon in the bombing of Hiroshima. These two issues are actually related, and I want to walk through them with you and use excerpts from previous interviews we've done on the first 16 episodes of Press the Button. So we're not going to have a single guest today. We're going to have multiple guests through the magic of recordings. You're going to hear from Ben Rhodes, from Alex Wellerstein, from Carol Cohn, from Beatrice Finn, and Dan Ellsberg on these two very important topics. Here's where we're going to start. Last week in the CNN debates with the Democratic presidential candidates, Jake Tapper asked Elizabeth Warren why she favored making it official U.S. policy that the U.S. would never start a nuclear war. Here's what she said.
The United States is not going to use nuclear weapons preemptively, and we need to say so to the entire world. It reduces the likelihood that someone miscalculates, someone misunderstands. Our first responsibility is to keep ourselves safe. And what's happening right now with Donald Trump, as they keep expanding the different ways that we have nuclear weapons, the different ways that they could be used, puts us all at risk.
Warren is exactly right. And most Americans don't realize that it is the official policy of the United States to reserve the option to start a nuclear war. Richard Nixon famously said that he could go into his office and pick up the telephone, and in 25 minutes, millions of people will be dead. And that's because of these two policies that we've had all these years based on Cold War logic, that the president and the president alone can authorize the use of nuclear weapons, and no one can stop him from doing that. There is no check on the president. That is, if Donald Trump gets upset and decides after watching a Fox News segment that he is going to bomb Iran, he can pick up the phone and order that bomb. He doesn't have to consult with Congress. There is no brief before the Supreme Court. There's no need to consult actually even with his Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State or National Security Advisor. He can do it. And as long as it's a legal order, and we have contingency plans for attacking Iran, the military is required to implement that. Trump said something like this just the other day when he went on national TV and said that he was considering ending the war in Afghanistan in 10 days, but because it would require him to kill 10 million people, he wouldn't do it.
If we wanted to fight a war in Afghanistan and win it, I could win that war in a week. I just don't want to kill 10 million people.
Well, the only way you kill 10 million people in 10 days is nuclear weapons. So he's got the authority to do that, and it's official U.S. policy to use nuclear weapons first, even if we're not attacked by nuclear weapons, even if we're not under threat of attack. We can just do it. And so these two things, the legal policy to use nuclear weapons first and the president's ability to give an order to use them, puts us in an extremely dangerous situation. But this debate goes way back, and it goes back to Hiroshima, to August 6, 1945, to the decision to use a nuclear weapon first. These were extremely difficult times. Japan was losing the war. We were winning the war. There were already secret discussions about a Japanese surrender, but it wasn't by any means certain, and there was a fear that it would require a U.S. invasion of Japan, causing hundreds of thousands of American casualties before Japan would actually surrender. So the appeal of using a nuclear bomb was quite strong, and we were the only ones who had it. Now remember, Japan didn't have a nuclear weapon. They weren't threatening us with attack, but we decided to go ahead and use that nuclear weapon in the hope that it would end the war. The war did end. The role of the nuclear weapon is still controversial. It's not at all clear that we needed to do that, and I want to bring in Alex Wellerstein right now to discuss this. I asked him in a previous podcast whether, knowing what we know now, would he have dropped the bomb? Here's what he said.
That's kind of a trick question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, a tricky one at least. So, there's a lot that you could think of to answer that. Let me put it this way. If I were a person in 1945 who didn't know what we know now,
yes,
it would have been a very hard thing to formulate an argument against dropping it that was persuasive. And this is what historians sometimes call this overdetermined. There were, for the people at that time, so many good reasons to do it.
Like?
Maybe it would end the war. That's not the only reason they had in mind, but it's one of them. Maybe it would scare the Soviet Union a bit. That would be useful in the Cold War. My favorite argument, this was one that the scientists put forward. Oppenheimer put this forward, as did Edward Teller, actually. Maybe the best thing you could hope for the first use of the atomic bomb would be for it to be as awful as possible, so that the world would take this seriously, and maybe it wouldn't happen again.
Okay, so how about Nagasaki?
Yeah.
So we do Hiroshima at August 6th,
yeah.
And then 3 days later, it's Nagasaki. Was that necessary? Was that justified? What do you think of it now?
I mean, there's really not a lot of evidence that the Nagasaki bombing changed anybody's minds in Japan. The timing is really tight. It's too tight. Really, if the goal is this sort of Nagasaki as the strategic response to Japan not surrendering, then give enough time. And that wasn't actually the plan, 3 days. The plan was to wait more like a week. So here's the sort of timeline broken down, right?
Yes.
Hiroshima was supposed to be dropped around August 3rd. Weather conditions in Japan pushed it to August 6th. The second bomb was supposed to be dropped August 10th. Weather conditions pushed it up to August 9th. So this is the weather dictating things. It's not some kind of complicated strategy. Night of August 8th, the Russians declare war on Japan, invade Manchuria. The Japanese high command sets up a meeting for August 9th to talk about the future of the war.
Right.
They go into that meeting more or less with the positions that they leave that meeting, which is they're ready to accept a form of conditional surrender. During that meeting, they get news about Nagasaki. Does not change. They barely even note it. And so this is, again, part of this argument of if Nagasaki was gone, not that we can rerun history, but if it didn't happen, would it have changed anything?
Alex Wellerstein is right. We can't turn back history, but we can learn from it. This was a horrific act. Yes, it may have helped win the war, but we killed 80,000 men, women, and children instantly, and an estimated 60 to 80,000 more died from burns, radiation poisoning, and the injuries that they suffered on that day. Maybe 160,000 men, women, and children killed. But was this the right thing to do? Did we need to do it? Was it morally correct to do it? Would we do it now? I asked Ben Rhodes, the former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama, whether Obama's White House learned the lessons of Hiroshima. Had they recognized what it would mean to explode a nuclear weapon over a city today? He told me about the time he accompanied Barack Obama to Hiroshima in 2016. It's a moving story. It was the first visit by a U.S. president to that city. It was difficult for the president to make that decision. It's hard to think now that that was seen as a sign of weakness, that it might be an apology for using the bomb. But that's what Barack Obama did. Here's Ben telling the story.
You know, it's one of the most powerful moments of my life. And you know, anybody who can go to Hiroshima, and I recognize it's not the easiest thing to do, but, you know, should. We flew in by helicopter, which was a little eerie because you're flying in by air, and you know, I remember seeing the shadow of the helicopter on literally the city and thinking about the shadow of a bomb falling. And part of what was so powerful is that we landed, and in the motorcade inn, there were tens of thousands of people there to welcome us. And it was a sign of the reconciliation that had taken place, that he was welcomed as the first U.S. president. But then you also look at the faces and the children, and you can't help but think that all of these people would have just been completely annihilated if this was the day that the bomb dropped. And then you stand, and President Obama stood at the center of the city, and you recognize that every single structure that I could see in my line of sight was something that had been built after this destruction. And, you know, putting aside where you are and whether or not we should have dropped the bomb, or certainly I'd say the secondary debate of whether we should have dropped the bomb on a city full of people, what he spoke about that was so powerful is that, you know, if human beings don't limit their capacity to have these kinds of technologies, the nature of human beings is there will be another Hiroshima. I mean, everybody thinks this is just something that happened in the past and will never happen again. But what is it about human beings? Why do we assume that human beings are somehow going to mature to a point where they can be trusted with this technology? I mean, look around our world today. Look at some of the people leading countries around the world today, not just here, but in other places. Do we really want to just take the bet that the combination of humanity's impulse towards conflict and towards nationalism and towards dehumanization of others, coupled with the presence and potentially increase of nuclear weapons, that won't result in another Hiroshima?
Well, that's Ben talking about this trip that happened in 2016. But back then, back in 45 and then into the 50s, the bombing of Hiroshima set off two reactions, and reactions that have persisted to this day. One response was horror. We have to get rid of these weapons before they destroy the world. The other reaction was of desire. We got to get some of these weapons. And it's these two tendencies, horror, desire, that have fought each other over the 74 years since then. Sometimes one dominates. Nuclear disarmament movements hold the fore. Leaders of different countries come and negotiate limitations and reductions. And sometimes the desire overcomes. New nations get these weapons, like Pakistan and India. We went nuclear nuts in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We and the Soviets built up 70, 75,000 nuclear weapons in the world. We've come a long way since then. We're down to about 14,000 in the world today. Still 95% held by the U.S. and Russia, but we've got a long way to go. But you have to go back to those nuclear nuts days to understand that the United States official policy was to launch a massive nuclear war that would have killed up to 600 million people and ended human civilization. But that was our policy. How do we know that? Because we got to talk to Dan Ellsberg, one of the policy analysts in the Department of Defense working on nuclear policy at the time. He's famous for his release of the Pentagon Papers. But here he is discussing his role as a nuclear analyst back in those days.
I drafted a question initially for the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, Robert McNamara, in 1961, to send to the Joint Chiefs, along with many other pages of questions that I had written for him, and which he did send. This particular question was sent, picked up by the deputy to the National Security Assistant, who was McGeorge Bundy, picked up by Robert Comer, his deputy, and sent to the Joint Chiefs in the name of the President. And that one question was, if your plans are carried out as planned, if they hit the targets that are intended, how many will die in the USSR and China? Unlike all the other questions that I asked through McNamara, which were stalled and eventually never answered, this one was answered within a week, with no apology or embarrassment. It was in the form of a graph showing how many millions would be killed initially, immediately, by fire and blast and prompt radiation. The figure was 275 million people. That slanted up to 50 million to 325 million people in the Soviets and China alone, without any retaliation by them and without figuring what the fallout would do in other parts of Europe. So I asked that question in the name of the President, and again got an answer back within a week, this time in the form of a table with columns for different countries. And the upshot of that was that our plans would kill another 100 million in East Europe, the so-called satellites, the slave countries, the occupied countries. We would kill 100 million of those, Poles, Romanians, Hungarians. And this is a plan by Americans, colonels and generals that I worked with every day in the Pentagon, drank beer with at night, very ordinary people, had made this plan, and we're perfecting it and carrying it forward.
Hundreds of millions dead, multiple iterations of World War II in a single afternoon. It's hard to imagine that this was our policy, that this still is our policy. We don't have as many nuclear weapons now, but there's no question that using these weapons now, thousands of weapons, in a spasmodic exchange would result not just in hundreds of millions of people dying immediately, but we now know that this would cause climate change. Not global warming, but a nuclear winter. That as few as 100 nuclear weapons would shroud the Earth in soot and particles that would drop global temperatures 2 or 3 degrees, killing most food crops in the world. Even one nation launching part of its arsenal could bring human civilization to a standstill, to a collapse. So why do we do this? Why do we insist that we still need to have the right to launch a nuclear war? Maybe we think, okay, one weapon, now what's the harm? What's going to happen? Well, it's what happens next. The other side gets a chance to respond. And this could trigger a war that could quickly go up into the hundreds, not just between the United States and Russia, but between India and Pakistan, for example, both of whom have arsenals that are at least 150 weapons currently and building more. So I spoke with Carol Cohn. She's the founding director of the Consortium on Gender Security and Human Rights, about why the United States has insisted on maintaining this enormous arsenal, and why we refuse to move away from starting a war, and why when those of us who favor disarmament, when those of us who favor banning nuclear weapons bring these issues up, that we're dismissed as being unrealistic, that our views are seen as out of step with cold, hard realities. Here's what Carol said.
What counts as realistic is the things that we count as manly or masculine, right? What counts as realistic is believing that somebody is always out to attack you, that you have to be well defended, that you have to have a huge military, that you have to be threatening. And anything associated with, quote, the feminine, like being concerned about the living conditions of your family, being, quote, idealistic, right? Because realism is always juxtaposed to idealism or to naivete. That anything that you want to think about, we're just back in our conversation before, if you want to think about security as something other than military might, that is considered naivete, unrealistic.
Right, so arms control.
That's exactly right. And I'd argue that that's evidence that we believe in the effectiveness of these kinds of methods, not because we actually look at what happens in the world and assess how useful they are, but because we have this gendered belief system. The thing that I keep on talking about is that we overestimate the efficacy of violence and undercount its costs. And the reason that we do that is because it just feels right to us. We just grow up knowing that what strength means is violence and the ability to threaten violence.
So Carol brings up this point. What happens when we allow nuclear weapons to exist alongside that tendency for human violence? Isn't it realistic to assume that they're going to be used someday? So I spoke with Beatrice Finn. She's the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN. They won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for their efforts to bring about a treaty banning nuclear weapons, a treaty that 122 nations have already voted for, and they're working to get that treaty ratified and brought into force in the next couple of years. Here's what she said about the morality of nuclear weapons.
I'm fascinated with some countries that have prohibited landmines because they indiscriminately target or impact civilians. Yet they are fine with threatening to mass murder civilians with nuclear weapons. I mean, those two things don't, how can you do one thing and not the other thing? How can you think it's legitimate to threaten to use these weapons? And a lot of people do it because, well, we're not actually going to use them. We're just threatening to use them.
Yes.
But you can't credibly threaten to use these weapons without actually being prepared to use them. And I think that's really what we need to challenge decision making. It's like, you are actually prepared to use them. And with this president here in the United States, I have no doubt that he would be prepared to use them if he felt like it.
He's threatened it on numerous occasions.
Exactly. So I think we really have to, if you are part of deterrence, if you believe in deterrence, you also have to accept the responsibility of the eventual use of nuclear weapons, and we have to talk about that. And I think that that's why it's so powerful to talk about what happens then, because you can only have these conversations and make it sound rational and sane if you never go into the consequences, if you never actually admit that they will be used one day. I think that's really, a lot of times people talk about disarmament as nuclear disarmament would be naive, unrealistic. I think it's naive and unrealistic to think that you can threaten with them forever and be prepared and exercise and say we're going to do this one day and then never happen. I mean, it's going to happen. If we don't get rid of nuclear weapons, it's going to happen one day. And then what? So I think we have to have the starting point that nuclear weapons will be used one day if we don't do anything about it.
I agree with Beatrice. You got to be a real optimist to think that we can keep these weapons in fallible human hands indefinitely and something terrible is not going to happen. Whether by miscalculation or accident or madness, something terrible will happen. We have got to intensify our efforts to forge a new nuclear policy for the United States, for the world, that reduces and eventually eliminates these weapons and changes these Cold War doctrines to 21st century realities. We can start where we began this podcast. We can make it the official policy of the United States never to start a nuclear war, and then work to get other nations to make other declarations and couple that with new arms control agreements, building on the ones we have instead of jettisoning them, keep the New START treaty, extend it, work for U.S.-Russian reductions, bring the other nuclear-armed countries into these reduction processes, forge an agreement with North Korea to reduce and eliminate its weapons, rejoin the Iran anti-nuclear agreement and work to extend it, make it permanent. These are practical steps that we must demand our leaders adopt as the only rational course for human beings. We're just at the beginning of the 21st century. If we want to see our children and grandchildren get to the end of it, there's a lot of work we have to be doing, and now is the time to do it. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This special segment was produced by Zach Brown, Alex Spire, and Derek Zender. Additional music featured in this special segment by Kevin MacLeod, Twin Musicom, Ashley Shadow, and Dan Bodan. To hear the complete interviews featured in this special segment, you can subscribe to Press the Button through Spotify, Apple Music, SoundCloud, Google Play, and all the usual podcast platforms. Or visit plowshares.org/pressthebutton for complete details. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Zach Brown. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.